Billionaire Julian Vane thought he knew what talent looked like. He'd paid millions for it in concert halls. But when his luxury sedan stalled in a rain-slicked alley, he heard a sound that made his $10,000 watch feel like a shackle. It was a homeless boy, barely 12, singing a melody so pure it felt like a haunting from Julian's own forgotten past. He didn't offer a coin. He offered a judgment that would later make him weep. He told the boy that pretty noises don't feed empty stomachs. But as Julian drove away, he saw a faded locket in the boy's hand. One that belonged to the sister Julian had lost 20 years ago. Hello everyone, and welcome to today's story. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more emotional, dramatic, and surprising stories ahead. Be sure to leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. To understand why a billionaire was hiding in a rain-soaked salat, we have to look back at the morning Julian Vane realized his empire was built on a foundation of silence. The day began like any other in Julian's glass and steel kingdom. High above the city, in a penthouse that breathed corporate ambition, the morning air was thick with the scent of expensive espresso and the silent pressure of a $10 billion merger. Julian adjusted his silk tie in a mirror that reflected a man who had everything, yet felt like he was drowning in shallow water. At 45 he was the architect of Vane Global, a firm that didn't just build skyscrapers, it dictated the skyline. He checked his Patek Philippe, the platinum weight on his wrist a constant reminder that time was his most expensive asset. His father, the late Silas Vane Sr., had taught him that the world was divided into two groups: those who moved the world, and those who were merely moved by it. Julian, the old man would say, compassion is a luxury for the middle class. At the top there is only mathematics. Julian had lived by that gospel for 2 decades. Every charitable donation was a calculated tax write-off. Every handshake was a strategic maneuver. He had long ago cauterized the part of his heart that felt empathy, believing it was the only way to protect the family legacy. An emergency board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. His rival, Sterling Vance, was making a play for the warehouse district, a territory Julian considered his own. As his driver steered the sleek, charcoal-gray sedan through the congested streets, the sky opened up. A heavy, relentless rain began to batter the city, turning the concrete canyons into gray rivers. Julian stared out the window, his mind racing through profit margins and litigation strategies. He didn't see the people huddling under bus stops, or the delivery workers soaked to the bone. To him, they were just part of the scenery. Then the car lurched. A strange grinding sound echoed from the engine, followed by a puff of white smoke that obscured the windshield. The driver pulled into a narrow secondary alley to get out of the main flow of traffic. "I'm sorry, Mr. Vane," the driver stammered, checking the dashboard. "It looks like the cooling system gave out. I'll call the service team immediately." Julian let out a sharp, frustrated exhale. He couldn't be late, not today. He looked at his watch again. The minutes were slipping away like water through his fingers. He stepped out of the car, shielding himself with a large black umbrella. Intending to walk to the main road to hail a cab, the alley was dark, smelling of wet brick and old decisions. It was a place where the city's invisible people sought shelter from the storm. Julian hurried his pace, his handmade Italian shoes clicking rhythmically against the rain-slicked pavement. He wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. The grit of the alley felt like an insult to his tailored suit. That's when the sound hit him. It wasn't the noise of the city or the rhythm of the rain. It was a voice. A boy's voice, high and incredibly clear, rising from behind a stack of water-damaged crates. The melody was haunting, an old folk song about a bird that forgot how to fly. There was no accompaniment, no microphone, just raw, unadulterated talent that cut through the gray morning like a laser. Julian stopped mid-stride. As a patron of the arts, he had heard the world's greatest tenors, but this was different. This had a soul that couldn't be taught in a conservatory. Julian rounded the corner and saw the singer. A black boy, maybe 12 years old, sat on a piece of cardboard. He was thin, wearing a donated jacket that was 3 sizes too large, his hair damp from the spray. He was singing to an older man who lay huddled under a pile of gray blankets. The boy's eyes were closed, his face tilted upward, as if he were seeing a sun that Julian couldn't. He didn't see the billionaire standing 5 feet away. He was entirely lost in the music. When the song ended, the boy opened his eyes. They were bright, intelligent, and filled with a weariness no child should possess. He looked at Julian, seeing the expensive coat and the polished umbrella. He didn't beg. He just held Julian's gaze with a quiet, devastating dignity. "You have a voice, kid," Julian said, his voice coming out harsher than he intended, a defense mechanism against the sudden surge of emotion he felt. "But this isn't the stage for it. Why are you out here?" The boy gestured to the old man under the blankets. "Grandpa Silas is cold," he said simply. The music helps him remember the warmth. Julian looked at the old man, then back at the boy. His father's voice echoed in his head. "The poor are desperate. They use emotion to bleed you dry." Julian reached into his pocket and realized he had no small bills. He only had his credit cards and a few $100 notes. He hesitated, his professional arrogance taking over. He didn't like being moved by a pretty noise in a gutter. "Listen, kid," Julian said, his tone turning corporate and cold. "Talent is a dime a dozen. Pretty noises don't feed empty stomachs, and they certainly don't pay for doctors. You're wasting your time." He turned to walk away, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt a strange, inexplicable anger, not at the boy, but at the way that voice had made him feel human for a split second. He took 3 steps toward the road when he heard the boy call out, "Wait, you dropped this." Julian turned around. The boy was standing up, holding something out. It wasn't Julian's wallet or his phone. The boy was holding a small faded silver locket. It had fallen from Julian's pocket where he kept it as a nervous habit during high-stakes meetings. Julian took a step back toward the boy to retrieve it, but as he reached out, his eyes fell on the boy's other hand. The boy was clutching an identical locket, faded, scratched, and held together by a thin piece of twine. Julian's breath caught in his throat. His hand began to tremble as he reached for the boy's hand instead of his own locket. He recognized the pattern on the silver, the intricate engraving of a weeping willow. It was a family heirloom, commissioned by his great-grandfather. There were only 2 in existence. Julian had one. The other had been around his sister Elena's neck the night she was cast out of the Vane mansion 20 years ago, for choosing love over money. The rain seemed to grow louder, the sound of it roaring in Julian's ears. He looked at the boy, the high cheekbones, the specific arch of the eyebrow, the exact vocal frequency he had just heard. It was his mother's face. It was Elena's voice. Julian realized with a cold, terrifying certainty that this wasn't just a street singer. This was the blood he had spent 2 days trying to forget. The boy looked at him, confused by the billionaire's sudden silence. "Is it yours, sir?" the boy asked, holding out the silver piece. Julian couldn't find his voice. He stared at the locket, then at the boy who called himself Elias. The $10,000 watch on his wrist felt like it was crushing his arm. He had spent years building a skyline, but he had allowed his own family to rot in the shadows of those very buildings. He looked at the locket in the boy's hand and then at his own. They were a perfect match. The truth didn't just dawn on him. It crashed into him like the demolition ball his company used to level the past. Julian realized the locket was identical to the one his mother took to her grave. The silver locket felt like a lead weight in Elias's palm, as he watched the billionaire's charcoal sedan eventually disappear into the gray curtain of rain. He didn't understand why the man had looked at him like he was seeing a ghost, or why he had suddenly stopped breathing when their eyes met. To Elias, Julian Vane was just another high-rise shadow, one of the powerful men who looked at the concrete as if it were a different planet. Elias wiped the rain from his forehead and carefully tucked both lockets, the one he had found, and the one he had always owned, deep into the hidden pocket of his oversized jacket. He didn't have time to solve the mysteries of rich men. Grandpa Silas was coughing again, a wet, rattling sound that cut through the rhythm of the downpour. Elias moved quickly, his thin slippers splashing through oily puddles as he navigated toward the back of the alley. Their home wasn't a house, or even a room with a door that locked. It was a corner of a sprawling, condemned warehouse, shielded by stacks of rotting wooden crates, and a tarp that leaked whenever the wind blew too hard. He found Silas huddled under the thin gray blankets Elias had scavenged from a shelter donation bin months ago. The old man's face was the color of ash, his breathing shallow and rapid. Elias knelt beside him, the cold from the concrete floor seeping through his jeans instantly. He took Silas's hand, which felt like brittle parchment, and began to hum the melody he had been singing earlier. "I'm back, Grandpa," Elias whispered, forcing a lightness into his voice that he didn't feel. He reached into his bag and pulled out a half-crushed granola bar, the only thing he'd managed to secure that morning. Silas opened his eyes, the milky haze of cataracts making his gaze soft and unfocused. He wasn't Elias's biological grandfather, but blood mattered very little in the gutter. 3 years ago, when Elias had run away from a foster home that felt more like a cage, Silas had been the one to find him. The old man had shared his cardboard, taught him how to find clean water, and most importantly, had listened to Elias sing when the rest of the world told him to be quiet. Silas was the only family Elias had left, and he was slipping away. "You sounds like her today," Silas wheezed, a small, pained smile touching his lips. "Like Elena. Every time you sing that song, boy, it's like she's standing right here in the rain with us." Elias paused, his heart skipping a beat. He knew his mother's name was Elena, but Silas rarely spoke of her. He only knew that Silas had worked as a janitor in the building where his mother had lived out her final, desperate days. Silas had promised a dying woman he would look after her son, and he had kept that promise through every winter and every hunger pang. Elias looked at the tarp above them, watching a single droplet of water hang before falling. He wondered why his mother had been so alone, and why the only thing she had left him was a silver locket, and a voice that people only noticed for 43 seconds at a time. As the afternoon light faded into a bruised purple, Elias realized they were out of the herbal tea Silas used to soothe his chest. The old man's fever was climbing, and his skin felt like a hot iron. Elias knew he needed real medicine, the kind that cost more than the few coins sitting in his torn cap. He looked at the silver locket the billionaire had dropped. It looked expensive, and the engraving was beautiful. A pawn shop would give him enough for a month of medicine and a warm room. But as he pulled it out, he looked at the identical one draped around his own neck. His mother had told him never to let it go. She had said it was the key to a door he wasn't ready to open yet. "I can't do it, Silas," Elias murmured to the sleeping man. "I can't sell her memory, even for your life. She said someone would come back for us." He clutched the silver willow engraving so hard it left a mark in his skin. He felt the crushing weight of a decision no 12-year-old should have to make. Honor the dead or save the living. He chose a third way. He would go back to the main road, to the theater district where the tourists gathered. He would sing until his throat was raw, until his voice gave out, or until the city finally got quiet enough to hear him. He didn't know that while he was preparing to fight for Silas's next breath, Julian Vane was sitting in a high-rise office, staring at a 20-year-old missing persons report, with his sister's name at the top. The journey to the theater district was a gauntlet of cold wind and suspicious glares. Elias stood under the glowing marquee of a grand opera house, a tiny figure in a sea of silk dresses and tailored overcoats. He closed his eyes and began to sing the song his mother had taught him. The one Silas called the Song of the Golden Sun. His voice climbed over the noise of the taxis and the chatter of the crowds, a silver thread of sound that seemed to stop time for everyone who passed. For a moment, he wasn't a homeless boy in a damp alley. He was a messenger, carrying a truth that the city had tried to bury under millions of tons of steel. A small crowd began to form, and for the first time, the coins began to drop into his cap with a steady rhythm. People were pulling out their phones, filming the boy with the angelic voice and the haunted eyes. Elias didn't notice the cameras. He was focused on the medicine, on the heat of Silas's fever, and the hope that he could earn enough to buy one more day of survival. But as the crowd grew, two men in security uniforms approached, their faces set in hard, uncompromising lines. They didn't see a talent. They saw a nuisance, a blemish on the polished image of the theater. "Move it along, kid," one of the guards barked, placing a heavy hand on Elias's shoulder. "No loitering. You're blocking the entrance." Elias stumbled back, his song cutting off abruptly. He grabbed his cap, clutching the few bills he'd earned, and retreated into the shadows. He had enough for the tea, maybe even some soup, but it wouldn't be enough to fix what was really broken. As he turned to run back toward the warehouse, he saw a black SUV idling at the curb. The tinted window rolled down just an inch, and Elias caught a glimpse of a pair of eyes that were unmistakably the same as his own. He ran, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached the warehouse, breathless and shivering, only to find the alley filled with a different kind of noise. There were bright floodlights cutting through the rain, and the low, guttural roar of heavy machinery. Elias's stomach dropped into his shoes as he saw a row of yellow bulldozers lined up at the entrance of the warehouse. A large sign had been bolted to the brick wall, the ink still fresh despite the dampness. It bore the logo of Vane Global Industries. Below the logo, in bold, heartless letters, were the words, "Demolition scheduled for 6 a.m. All unclaimed property will be destroyed." Elias looked at the tarp where Grandpa Silas lay unconscious, then at the machines that were coming to erase their only sanctuary. Realizing with a jolt of terror that the man he had returned the locket to was the same man who was about to bury them alive. The air in the Vane Global boardroom was thin, filtered through industrial vents, and heavy with the scent of expensive cologne and unspoken threats. Julian Vane sat at the head of the mahogany table, but his mind was miles away, anchored in a rain-slicked alley. Before him lay a contract that would finalize the acquisition of the warehouse district, a deal worth billions. His board members were speaking, their voices a drone of percentages and logistical hurdles. But Julian could only hear that boy's voice, high, clear, and hauntingly familiar. He looked down at his wrist, the platinum watch flashing under the LED lights, and felt a sudden, inexplicable surge of nausea. He realized he had been building a skyline, while his own family was potentially breathing in the dust of his progress. Julian, the Q4 projections for the demolition are on slide 12, Sterling Vance said, his voice smooth and dangerous. Sterling was Julian's chief rival and a man who treated business like a blood sport. He watched Julian with eyes that never quite blinked, sensing a crack in the billionaire's armor. Julian looked up, forcing his features into a mask of corporate indifference. He couldn't let Sterling see the locket vibrating in his pocket. A secret that threatened to dismantle 20 years of carefully curated isolation. He nodded curtly, but his hand gripped his fountain pen so hard the plastic groaned. The meeting ended with a round of self-congratulatory handshakes, but as soon as the doors closed, Julian summoned his head of security, a man named Miller who knew how to find things that didn't want to be found. "I need you to track someone," Julian said, his voice barely a whisper. "A boy 12 years old sits on Junction and 5th. He has a silver locket." Julian paused, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Find out where he sleeps, find out who he is with, and Miller, do it quietly. If Sterling Vance gets wind of this, your career ends before the sun sets." While Miller moved through the city's digital underbelly, Julian retreated to his private study. He pulled out a leather-bound journal, the one his mother had left him. In the back, tucked into a hidden sleeve, was a missing persons report from 2 decades ago. Elena Vane. Age 19, last seen leaving the Vane estate with nothing but a suitcase and a silver willow locket. Julian ran his thumb over his sister's name. His father had told him that Elena was dead to them, that she had betrayed their blood for a nobody with a guitar, and no future. Julian had believed the lie because it was easier than feeling the weight of her absence. But now, the guilt he had suppressed for 20 years was acting like a poison, turning his success into ash. Later that afternoon, the rain returned, turning the city into a blurred watercolor of gray and black. Julian stood at his floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the streets he owned but did not understand. His phone buzzed. It was Miller. "I found him, sir. He's living in the old textile warehouse on 14th Street. He's not alone. He's caring for an elderly man, a former janitor named Silas." Julian went cold. The 14th Street warehouse was the center of his new development project. It was the first building scheduled for demolition. Julian looked at his watch. 4:15 p.m. The demolition crews were already staging their equipment. The legal notices had been served weeks ago. To the city planners, that warehouse was a blight, a hollow shell of brick and broken glass. To Julian, it was a box on a spreadsheet. But to a boy with a voice like an angel and a locket that screamed of the past, it was a sanctuary. Julian realized that what the rich called redevelopment, the poor called the destruction of life. He had spent his life making decisions from the 50th floor, never once considering the consequences for those living in the shadows of his steel. He grabbed his coat and bypassed his driver, taking his personal car instead. He needed to see it for himself. He needed to know if the boy was truly Elena's son, or if the universe was playing a cruel trick on him. As he drove through the congested traffic, he thought about the letters his father had intercepted. Letters from Elena that Julian was never allowed to read. He had been the golden son, the one who stayed, the one who obeyed. And in return for his obedience, he had lost the only person who had ever truly loved him for his soul rather than his bank account. Julian reached the warehouse district just as the light was failing. The neighborhood was a maze of cracked pavement and flickering street lamps. He saw the black and yellow tape of Vane Global cordoning off the textile building. Large floodlights were being positioned, their harsh white beams cutting through the gloom. The roar of diesel engines began to hum in the air, the sound of progress preparing to bite into the past. Julian parked his car and stepped out, the rain soaking through his silk shirt instantly. He looked at the massive structure and felt a crushing sense of urgency. He approached the main entrance where a foreman was checking a clipboard. "Everything is on schedule, Mr. Vane," the foreman said, surprised to see the CEO on site. We start the primary sweep in 10 minutes. The structural integrity is gone, we're bringing it down fast. Julian didn't answer. He pushed past the man, his expensive shoes crunching over debris and discarded needles. He stepped into the cavernous interior, the air smelling of damp earth and rot. He pulled out his phone, the screen glowing like a beacon in the dark. "Elias?" Julian called out, his voice echoing off the high rusted rafters. Silence followed, save for the steady drip of water somewhere in the distance. He moved deeper into the shadows. Toward the back corner where Miller had reported the boy was hiding, he saw a makeshift wall of crates and a tattered blue tarp. Behind it a small fire flickered in a metal drum. Julian rounded the corner and stopped. There was the boy Elias, kneeling on the cold floor, his head bowed. He was singing again, a low, desperate melody that sounded like a prayer. Elias looked up, his eyes widening as he recognized the man from the alley. He stood up defensively, shielding the old man huddling under the blankets behind him. "You can't be here," Elias said, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. "The guards said we have to leave, but Silas can't move. He's too sick." Julian looked at the boy, then at the locket pinned to his chest. In the dim firelight, the silver willow seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Julian took a step forward, his corporate mask finally shattering. "I know who you are," Julian whispered, his voice breaking. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his own locket, holding it up so the boy could see the twin engravings. Elias stared at the silver piece, his breath catching. He reached for the locket around his own neck, his fingers shaking. Outside, the low, guttural roar of a bulldozer intensified as it moved toward the front wall. The ground beneath their feet began to vibrate. Julian looked at the ceiling, realization hitting him like a physical blow. He had given the order. He had set the machines in motion. And now, he was standing in the very heart of the target. Julian realized the investigator had found the boy's home. A condemned warehouse scheduled for demolition by Julian's own company. The dust in the warehouse tasted of rust and forgotten histories. A thick, choking cloud that Julian Vane's lungs were not built to handle. He stood paralyzed as the ground beneath his handmade loafers shuddered, with a rhythmic, mechanical pulse. It was the sound of a beast awakening. Outside, the primary demolition crew had begun the vibratory checks, testing the structural weakness of the front facade. Julian looked up at the ceiling, seeing the long, jagged cracks in the concrete rafters groan under the pressure. He realized with a jolt of terror that he had spent his life making decisions from the 50th floor, treating city blocks like squares on a chessboard, never once considering the warm blood and beating hearts hiding in the shadows of his blueprints. Elias didn't move. He stood like a small, defiant shield in front of the mound of blankets where Grandpa Silas lay. The boy's eyes weren't filled with the awe Julian usually received from the public. They were filled with a fierce, protective hatred. "You did this," Elias shouted over the rising drone of the engines. "You sent the men with the clipboards. You told them this place was empty. But Silas has been here since before you owned the air we breathe." Julian flinched, the words cutting through his tailored armor more effectively than any rival's corporate raid. He looked at the tattered blue tarp seat and the small fire in the metal drum, realizing that this condemned shell was more of a home than his cold, echoing penthouse had ever been. Julian lunged for his phone, his fingers slick with cold sweat as he dialed the site foreman. The call connected just as a massive thud echoed from the north wall, the first strike of a pneumatic breaker. "Stop!" Julian screamed into the receiver. "Abort the demolition, there are people inside. Do you hear me? Cease all operations immediately." There was a confused crackle on the other end, the foreman stammering about schedules and safety zones. Julian didn't wait for a confirmation. He shoved the phone into his pocket and turned back to Elias, who was now desperately trying to lift Silas by his thin, brittle shoulders. The old man was barely conscious, his eyes rolling back as a fit of rattling coughs seized his chest. "We have to move him, Elias," Julian said, his voice dropping into a low, urgent tone. "The building isn't safe. Even if the machines stop, the vibrations could bring the roof down." He approached the makeshift bed, but Elias pushed him back with a strength born of pure desperation. "Don't touch him, you've taken enough from us," the boy cried. Julian stopped, holding up his hands, the silver locket dangling from his fingers. "I am Julian, I am. I think I'm your mother's brother. I'm not here to take anything. I'm here to get you out." A piece of masonry fell from a high rafter, shattering like a glass bottle only 3 feet from where they stood. The silence that followed was heavy and terrifying. Elias looked at the locket, then at Julian's face, searching for the lie he expected to find. He saw only the raw, frantic guilt of a man who had finally realized the cost of his silence. Slowly, Elias stepped aside. Julian knelt on the filthy concrete, ignoring the ruin of his $8,000 coat, and slid his arms beneath the old man. Silas was light, frighteningly light, as if he were made of nothing but bird bones and shadows. As they began the slow, treacherous walk toward the rear exit, the engines outside finally cut to a low idle. The sudden quiet was almost louder than the noise had been. Julian carried Silas, while Elias clutched his small bag of belongings, his eyes never leaving the old man's face. They moved through the darkness of the warehouse, past the rusted machinery, and the ghosts of an industry Julian's father had helped destroy. Julian felt a strange primal heat radiating from the boy beside him, a frequency of survival that made his entire corporate empire feel like a house of cards. They reached the service door just as the rain began to turn into a freezing sleet. Julian's personal car sat idling at the edge of the demolition zone, its headlights cutting through the mist like the eyes of an impatient predator. He signaled Miller, his security chief, who hurried forward to help settle Silas into the back seat. Elias climbed in next to the old man, his small hand locked onto Silas's wrist, as if he were measuring every heartbeat. Julian stood in the rain for a moment, looking back at the warehouse. He saw the Vane Global logo on the side of the bulldozer, and for the first time, it looked like a mark of shame. Inside the car, the air was warm and smelled of expensive leather, a jarring contrast to the damp rot they had just escaped. Elias looked around the cabin with wide, suspicious eyes, his fingers tracing the silver willow on his locket. He reached into his bag and pulled out a stack of envelopes, yellowed at the edges and tied with a piece of blue ribbon. "My mom wrote these," Elias whispered, his voice trembling. "She said they were for the golden son. She said he was a prince who lived in a castle of glass and forgot how to look down." Julian felt the air leave his lungs. He reached for the letters but his hand froze mid-air. He wasn't ready. He wasn't worthy of the words his sister had spent a lifetime trying to send him. He looked at Silas, whose breath was becoming more labored with every passing second. "Take us to the private wing at St. Jude's," Julian ordered Miller, "and tell them to have the chief of pulmonary medicine waiting at the door. I don't care what it costs. Save him." He turned back to Elias, but the boy wasn't looking at the luxury around him. He was looking at Julian's platinum watch, then back at the locket. "Why didn't you come sooner?" Elias asked. The question was simple, direct, and devastating. Julian had no corporate jargon to hide behind. He had no litigation strategy to deflect the truth. He had been too busy building a world that didn't have room for people like them. He opened his mouth to apologize, but the words died in his throat as the car swerved. A black sedan had pulled across the road, blocking their path. The driver's side door opened, and Sterling Vance stepped out, a mocking smile playing on his lips as he held up a high-resolution camera. Julian watched in horror as Sterling pointed the lens directly at the car window, capturing the image of the city's most powerful billionaire, huddling with a homeless boy and a dying man. The flash of the camera felt like a physical blow. Sterling leaned toward the glass and mouthed three words that made Julian's blood run cold. "Brands ruined, Julian." As the car sped away, Julian looked at the letters in Elias's lap and the terrified boy beside him, realizing that the warehouse was only the first thing he was about to lose. Julian arrived at the warehouse just as the bulldozers started their engines. The charcoal gray sedan lunged forward, weaving around Sterling Vance's car with a violent screech of tires. Julian didn't look back at the flash of the camera, but he could feel the digital burn of that image already spreading through the cloud. Beside him, Elias was trembling, his small hands white-knuckled as they gripped Silas's limp wrist. The air in the car, once a symbol of Julian's insulated privilege, now felt like a pressurized chamber. Every second that passed without a sound from the old man in the back seat added another layer of crushing weight to Julian's chest. He had spent his life managing risks on paper, but he had never felt a risk this primal, this tied to the very blood in his veins. "Faster, Miller," Julian commanded, his voice a jagged edge. He didn't care about traffic laws or the Vane Global reputation anymore. He looked at Elias, whose wet, oversized jacket was staining the pristine leather. For the first time in his life, Julian didn't see a stain. He saw a boy who had been forced to become a fortress for a dying man, while Julian sat in a fortress of glass. He reached out, his hand hovering over Elias's shoulder, but he pulled it back. He was a stranger to this boy, a man who had only offered insults before the world began to fall apart. He realized that true wealth wasn't the car or the watch. It was the trust he had never earned. They arrived at St. Jude's private wing in a blur of rain and emergency lights. Julian didn't wait for the orderlies. He was out of the car before it fully stopped, shouting for the specialists he had summoned. A team of elite doctors, the kind who usually treated royalty and heads of state, descended upon the vehicle with clinical precision. As they lifted Silas onto a gurney, the old man let out a sudden jagged gasp. His eyes fluttered open for a split second, fixed on Julian's face. In that brief moment, the milky haze of cataracts seemed to clear, replaced by a shock of recognition so intense it made Julian stumble back against the car. Julian? Silas wheezed, the name barely more than a puff of air. The billionaire froze. He didn't know this man. He had never met this janitor from the slums. But the way Silas said his name wasn't the way an employee spoke to a boss. It was the way a keeper spoke to a ghost. Before Julian could respond, the doctors were already whisking the gurney toward the ICU. The rhythmic beep of a portable monitor, fading into the sterilized silence of the hallway. Elias started to follow, but Julian caught his arm, his grip firm but careful. "Stay here, Elias. They need to work," Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, grounding frequency. The boy looked at him, his face a mask of terror and mistrust. "You called him by name," Elias whispered. "How did he know you? He hasn't spoken to a man in a suit in 3 years." Julian had no answer. He looked at the silver locket dangling from Elias's hand and felt the twin piece in his own pocket growing hot. He led the boy to a quiet waiting alcove, a space filled with velvet chairs and soft lighting that felt like an insult to the cold warehouse they had just fled. Julian sat across from the boy, the silence between them filled with the ghosts of 20 years. He watched Elias pull the stack of yellowed letters from his bag, the blue ribbon frayed and dull. "My mom told me that if I ever met the golden son, I should give him these," Elias said, his voice small but steady. "She said they were the only things he couldn't buy." He handed the top envelope to Julian. The handwriting was unmistakable, the elegant slanted script of his sister Elena. Julian's fingers brushed Elias's as he took the paper, and he felt a spark of that same frequency he had heard in the boy's voice. Julian opened the letter with the precision of a man defusing a bomb. "Dear Julian," it began, the ink slightly smeared as if by a teardrop. "If you are reading this, it means the silence has finally broken. I saw your face on a magazine today, standing in front of a tower that reaches for heaven. Do you ever look down, brother? Do you ever see the people in the shadows of your steel? I am leaving this with Silas, the only man who stayed when our father's money ran out. He promised to protect my son from the vain name. Don't let him become like father, please." The words hit Julian harder than any pneumatic breaker. He looked at Elias, who was watching him with wide, searching eyes. The boy wasn't just a singer, he was the living evidence of Julian's cowardice. For 20 years, Julian had chosen his father's mathematics over his sister's heart. And the result was a 12-year-old boy, living in a condemned warehouse. Julian felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he realized Silas wasn't just a random stranger. He was the man who had done the job Julian was too afraid to do. Silas was the one who had kept the Vane bloodline alive, while Julian was busy counting his billions. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the chime of the elevator. Sterling Vance stepped out, his silk suit dry and his smile razor-sharp. He wasn't alone. A phalanx of legal assistants and a city housing official trailed behind him. Sterling walked directly to Julian, ignoring the terrified boy in the velvet chair. "A touching scene, Julian," Sterling mocked, gesturing to Elias. "Billionaire plays savior for the cameras, but we have a problem. The 14th Street warehouse wasn't just empty. It was a biohazard. And you just brought an unregistered minor into a high-security medical wing without legal guardianship." Sterling leaned in close, his voice dropping to a predatory whisper. "The board is already voting. They don't like instability, Julian. And a CEO who stops a billion-dollar demolition for a gutter brat is the definition of unstable. Give me the warehouse district, or I release the rest of the footage. I'll make sure the world sees you as a man who's lost his mind. And I'll make sure the state takes that boy into a system he'll never survive." Julian looked at the rival who had spent 20 years manipulating his father. Then at the boy who held the locket of a lost sister. He felt the cold, corporate logic trying to take hold, telling him to settle, to protect the Vane global brand. But then he heard it, a faint sound from the ICU hallway. It wasn't a scream or a gasp. It was the sound of a nurse's footsteps running toward them. Julian's heart stopped as the double doors swung open, and the lead surgeon stepped out, his face pale and his gloves stained with blood. Julian realized Silas had recognized his voice, not as a CEO but as the boy his wife used to cry about in her sleep. Julian felt the world tilt as the surgeon stepped into the dim light of the waiting alcove. The sterile smell of the hospital, which usually represented Julian's ability to buy health and longevity, now felt like the cold breath of a reckoning. He looked at the surgeon's blood-stained gloves and then at Elias, who had stood up so fast. His chair clattered against the marble floor. The boy's face was a map of raw, unfiltered panic, his small hands still clutching the ribbon-tied letters, as if they were a shield against the news that was coming. Sterling Vance stood only a few feet away, his phone still out, his expression one of greedy anticipation, waiting for the billionaire's final collapse into ruin. "Mr. Vane, we have a pulse, but his lungs are failing," the surgeon said, his voice carrying the professional flatness of someone who dealt in life and death as a daily trade. "He's asking for you. Specifically you. He's stable for the next few minutes but he keeps repeating a name. Not yours. He's asking for Elena." The mention of his sister's name felt like a physical blow to Julian's chest, a name he hadn't allowed himself to speak for 20 years. He realized that Silas wasn't just a guardian, he was the bridge to the only person Julian had ever truly loved. Julian turned to Miller, his voice dropping into a low, jagged command. "Get Sterling out of here. If he so much as breathes near this boy, use every legal and physical resource we have to erase his presence." Sterling laughed, a dry rattling sound that filled the alcove with corporate venom. "You're hiding behind Miller now, Julian? The board is watching. You're trading a billion-dollar merger for a janitor's last words. Think about the legacy." Julian didn't even look back. He took Elias by the shoulder, his grip firm but grounding, and led him toward the double doors of the ICU. The air inside the unit was thick with the rhythmic, artificial hiss of ventilators, and the sharp, urgent beeping of cardiac monitors. Julian's expensive coat, ruined by the warehouse mud, felt heavy and ridiculous in this room where money held no sway. They reached Silas's bedside, a tangle of tubes and wires, connecting the old man to a world that was clearly finished with him. Silas looked smaller now, his skin like translucent parchment, but his eyes were wide and searching, darting around the room until they settled on Julian. "I kept the promise," Silas wheezed, the sound of his breath like dry leaves skittering across pavement. He reached out a trembling, calloused hand toward Elias, who surged forward and pressed the old man's palm against his cheek. She told me you were a prince. But I saw you in the alley, Julian. You weren't a prince. You were just a man with a broken car and a cold heart." Silas coughed, a wet, agonizing sound that made the cardiac monitor spike into a frantic rhythm. Julian knelt by the bed, the cold floor biting into his knees, and he felt a shame so deep it threatened to swallow him whole. He realized that this man, who earned less in a year than Julian spent on a single dinner, had more dignity and integrity in his dying breath than Julian had cultivated in 4 decades of privilege. "I'm sorry, Silas," Julian whispered, the words feeling foreign and clumsy in his mouth. "I didn't know. I wasn't looking down." Silas gripped Julian's wrist with a sudden, surprising strength. "Don't look down at him, Julian. Look at him. He has her voice. He has your mother's arch in his brow. He is the only thing left of the love you threw away." Silas's eyes drifted to the stack of letters in Elias's lap. "Read them." She never stopped writing, every birthday, every Christmas. She thought you were just busy. She didn't know you had. You had turned your back on your own blood. Elias began to hum, the high clear melody of the folk song he had sung in the alley, his voice a silver thread of sound that seemed to calm the erratic beeping of the machines. Julian felt the ice around his heart finally shatter, the freezing sleet outside, matching the cold realization that he had spent his life building towers of glass, while the foundation was rotting in the shadows. He looked at the boy, his nephew, and saw the face of a sister who had died believing her brother was still a prince. "The letters, Julian," Silas gasped, his grip on Julian's wrist tightening one last time before going limp. "They aren't just memories, they are the map. She found it. She found the thing our father hid. The reason she was cast out. It wasn't the boy with the guitar, it was the truth. About the Vane global fortune." The monitor let out a long, continuous tone, a flat line that echoed through the room like a final judgment. Silas's eyes remained fixed on Julian, but the spark of recognition was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunting stillness. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Elias didn't scream. He just leaned his forehead against Silas's cooling hand, his shoulders shaking with the weight of a grief no 12-year-old should have to carry. Julian stood up, his legs feeling like lead, and looked at the stack of yellowed envelopes. He realized that Silas's death was only the beginning. He had been a billionaire king, but the man on the gurney had just handed him a truth that would either set him free or burn his entire empire to the ground. Julian walked out of the ICU, his face a mask of hard, cold determination. He found Miller waiting in the hallway, Sterling Vance nowhere to be seen. "Where is he?" Julian asked, his voice low and dangerous. "He's at the hotel, sir. He's already leaking the photos of you at the warehouse to the press. The board has called an emergency session for midnight. They're moving to remove you as CEO." Julian looked at the locket in his hand, and then at the door where Elias was still huddling over the body of the only father he had ever known. He reached into the stack of letters and pulled out the one Elena had marked with a wax seal. The Vane family crest. A symbol Julian thought was only for the golden sun. He broke the seal with trembling fingers and read the first line. "Julian, if Silas gave you this, it means you have finally chosen to see. Father didn't cast me out because I loved a musician. He cast me out because I found the original ledger. Vane Global was built on a theft far greater than yours." Julian stared at the words as his phone began to vibrate relentlessly with news alerts of his downfall. Realizing that the man who had just flatlined was the only one who truly knew that Julian's empire was a lie. Julian realized that the most dangerous secret in the city wasn't hidden in a boardroom, but in the pocket of a boy who had every reason to watch him fall. Julian stood in the corridor of St. Jude's private wing, the silence following Silas's death, pressing against his eardrums like a physical force. In his hand, the letter from Elena felt heavier than the billion-dollar contracts he usually signed. He looked through the reinforced glass of the ICU door at Elias, who was still huddled by the bed, a small island of grief in a sea of sterile white. Julian's world was spinning. He had spent decades believing his wealth was a fortress built on merit and family legacy, but the words on that yellowed paper suggested it was a monument to a crime. His father, Silas Vane Sr., hadn't just been a hard man. He had been a thief who had used Julian as his golden son to polish a tarnished crown. The chime of Julian's phone was relentless. He pulled it from his pocket and saw the headlines already screaming across the screen. Vane Global CEO caught in slum scandal. Sterling Vance's work was efficient and brutal. The board of directors was already mobilizing, their loyalty evaporating at the first scent of a public relations disaster. Julian knew the math of his father's gospel. When a man becomes a liability, he is removed. But for the first time in 40 years, the math didn't matter. He turned his back on the glowing screen and walked into the quiet room to stand beside his nephew. "Elias," Julian said, his voice thick and unfamiliar to his own ears. The boy didn't look up, his fingers still entwined with the old man's calloused hand. Julian reached out and placed his own hand on Elias's shoulder, not with the calculated distance of a benefactor, but with the trembling uncertainty of a man finding his soul. "He's gone, Julian," Elias whispered, the use of the billionaire's first name cutting through the silence. "He was the only one who didn't look through me. He was my real castle." Julian felt a sharp pain in his chest, a realization that he had built towers while this boy had built a life out of kindness and shadows. Julian knelt on the cold floor, ignoring the ruin of his silk trousers, and looked at the stack of letters Elias had protected. "He saved you, Elias, and he tried to save me too. He kept these because he knew one day I'd have to choose between the glass and the blood." Julian looked at the wax-sealed envelope in his hand, the crest of Vane Global staring back at him. He realized that the warehouse demolition hadn't just been about property. It had been an unconscious attempt to bury the evidence of his father's sins. Silas hadn't just been a janitor. He was the keeper of the truth that Julian's father had tried to erase 20 years ago. Suddenly, Miller, the head of security, stepped into the room, his face grim. "Mr. Vane, Sterling Vance has the hospital board on the phone. They're claiming Elias is a ward of the state, and that you have no legal standing to keep him here. They've dispatched a social services team to the private wing." Elias's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a terror Julian hadn't seen even during the demolition. "They're going to take me back," the boy gasped, his voice losing its silver quality and turning into a desperate plea. "Silas promised I'd never have to go back to the cage." Julian stood up, a new kind of power surging through him, one that didn't come from a stock portfolio. He looked at the boy who had his mother's brow and his sister's heart. He thought about the receipts for medicine and the donated coats he had seen in other people's lives. Realizing that dignity wasn't something you bought. It was something you defended. He looked at Miller and spoke with a clarity that silenced the beeping of the machines. Bar the doors. Call my lead counsel. We aren't just filing for guardianship. We're declaring that Elias Vane is the heir to Vane Global. Miller blinked in shock. Sir, the board will never accept that. Sterling will use the letters to claim the fortune is fraudulent. Julian tightened his grip on the stack of envelopes. Let him. If the empire is built on a lie, then I'll be the one to tear it down myself. But no one is taking this boy. Not tonight. Not ever. Julian saw a flicker of hope in Elias's eyes, a small fragile light that felt more valuable than the platinum watch on his wrist. He realized that the mathematics of his life was changing. The only numbers that mattered now were the heartbeats of the family he had tried to forget. The sound of voices began to rise in the hallway. The sharp, professional tones of people arriving to execute a protocol. Sterling Vance's laughter echoed through the corridor as he had approached, relishing the moment of Julian's total collapse. Julian turned to Elias and handed him the silver willow locket he had found in the alley. Keep this, Elias. It belongs to the Golden Sun, and from now on, that isn't me, it's you. The boy took the silver, his fingers steadying as he felt the weight of the family name for the first time. Julian walked toward the double doors, his posture shifting from the defeated huddle of a mourner to the fierce resolve of a protector. He looked back at Silas's body, a man who had died with more integrity than Julian had ever known, and whispered a silent promise to the shadows. As he reached for the door handle to face Sterling and the world, his phone buzzed one last time. It was a message from an encrypted number, one that Silas must have set to trigger upon his heart rate flatlining. Julian stopped mid-stride as the text appeared on his screen. It wasn't a warning or a legal threat. It was a digital image of a single page from the original Vane Global ledger, dated 20 years ago. The entry showed a massive transfer of funds, not to a business partner, but to a private account in Julian's own name that he had never known existed. Julian stared at the screen, his blood running cold as he realized his father hadn't just built a lie. He had made Julian the unknowing accomplice to the theft that had killed his sister. Julian realized that to save the boy, he would have to admit to the world that his entire life was a crime. The light from Julian's smartphone screen burned into his retinas, a digital brand of shame that made the sterilized hospital air feel even thinner. He stared at the ledger entry Silas's ghost had sent him. A transfer of $50 million to an account in his own name, executed on the exact day Elena had been cast out 20 years ago. He realized then that his father's Golden Sun wasn't just a nickname, it was a laundering scheme. Julian hadn't just benefited from his sister's exile, he had been the literal vault where her stolen inheritance was hidden. He looked at Elias, who was still clutching Silas's cold hand, and felt a wave of nausea so violent, he had to lean against the cold glass of the ICU door for support. Julian's thumb swiped across the screen, opening the next image in the encrypted file. It was a scanned birth certificate. Name, Elias Silas Vane. Mother, Elena Vane. Father, unknown. But it was the date that stopped Julian's heart. Elias had been born only months after Elena vanished into the rain. His sister had been pregnant, alone, and hunted by her own father's legal team, while Julian was in Switzerland, learning how to maximize profit margins. He realized that every luxury he had ever known, the Patek Philippe on his wrist, the charcoal gray sedan, the towers of glass, had been paid for with the survival of a child he never knew existed. The sound of heavy, rhythmic footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor. Julian looked up to see Sterling Vance approaching, flanked by 2 social workers and a uniformed officer. Sterling was smiling, the kind of expression a predator wears when the prey is finally cornered against a cliff. The clock's run out to Julian? Sterling, he said, his voice booming in the quiet wing. The board has seen the photos. They've seen you huddling in a condemned warehouse with a vagrant. You're being placed on administrative leave effective immediately. And as for the boy, Sterling gestured to the social worker with a sharp manicured finger. He's an unregistered minor in a restricted medical zone. He goes to the state facility tonight. Julian stood up straight, the weight of the letters in his pocket acting like an anchor. He didn't look at the officer or the social workers. He looked directly into Sterling's greedy, unblinking eyes. Elias isn't going anywhere, Julian said. His voice was low, but it held a grounding frequency that made the social workers hesitate. He is my nephew. And more than that, he is the majority shareholder of Vane Global. My father didn't just cast Elena out, Sterling. He stole her trust. And according to the Vane family bylaws, that theft nullifies my right to lead. The inheritance reverts to her heir. Sterling's smile faltered, a flicker of genuine shock crossing his face before he masked it with a laugh. "You're delusional, Julian. You're going to burn your entire life to save a kid who's been singing for nickels in a gutter. You'll be in a cell by morning if you try to pull that ledger into court." Julian stepped forward, closing the distance until he could smell Sterling's expensive cologne, the scent of a man who had never known hunger or cold. "Then I'll be the one to light the match," Julian whispered. "Because I've spent 20 years living in a prison of glass. And for the first time, I finally know what the air tastes like outside." He turned back to the room and signaled Miller. The head of security moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had finally found a cause worth defending. Miller placed himself between the doorway and the authorities, his posture a clear warning that no one was entering that room without a war. Julian walked to Elias, who had finally let go of Silas's hand. The boy looked up, his eyes searching Julian's face for the golden sun his mother had written about. Julian knelt in the mud-stained remains of his coat and reached out, his hand finally connecting with Elias's shoulder. "Silas kept his promise, Elias," Julian said, his voice breaking with a human depth he hadn't felt in decades. "He protected you from the vain name. But I need you to listen to me. I was the one who built the walls. I was the one who forgot to look down. But I am not going to let them take you." He pulled the twin silver locket from his pocket and pressed it into the boy's palm, the silver willow engravings matching perfectly. "This isn't just jewelry, it's a key. And it's time we used it to unlock the doors my father closed." Elias looked at the lockets, then at the authorities waiting in the hallway. He saw the greed in Sterling's eyes and the fierce, frantic protectiveness in Julian's. Slowly the boy reached into his oversized jacket and pulled out a small, tattered notebook, the one Anna had used in her own story of dreams and steel. "Silas said that if you ever chose the blood over the glass, I should show you the last page," Elias whispered. He opened the notebook to a sketch of a building. Not a tower of steel, but a community center with wide doors and roof gardens. Built for people who had nowhere else to turn. Julian felt a lump form in his throat as he recognized his sister's vision in the boy's drawings. Elena hadn't wanted the billionaire life. She had wanted a world where no one was invisible. He realized that his sister hadn't betrayed the family. She had been the only one trying to save its soul. He stood up and faced the hallway again, his posture shifting into that of a man who had already decided his future. He didn't care about the board vote or the scandal or the downfall Sterling was so eager to broadcast. "Miller," Julian commanded, his voice echoing with an authority that didn't need a title. "Escort my nephew to the penthouse. Use the private entrance, and call the press. Tell them the CEO of Vane Global has a confession to make." Julian looked at Sterling, whose face was now pale with a growing realization that the billionaire wasn't settling. He was surrendering the empire to save the child. Sterling lunged forward, but the officer stepped in his way, recognizing the sudden shift in gravity in the room. Julian walked past them all, his steps heavy but determined. He reached the elevator and waited for the chime, the sound of Elias's silver humming still echoing in the ICU room behind him. As the doors began to close, Sterling shouted one last desperate threat. "You're losing everything, Julian. You'll be nobody by morning." Julian looked at his reflection in the polished brass doors, a man covered in warehouse dust and hospital grief, and smiled a real quiet smile. "I've been nobody for 20 years, Sterling," Julian said as the doors clicked shut. "Tonight, I'm finally becoming a brother." He pulled his phone out and sent a single command to his legal team, one that would initiate a full audit of the Vane Global Foundation and expose every theft his father had hidden. But as the elevator began its ascent to the 50th floor, the lights flickered and the car lurched to a sudden, bone-jarring halt between floors. Julian stared at the control panel as it went dark, realizing that Sterling wasn't just coming for his brand, he was coming for his life. Julian realized that the most dangerous secret wasn't Elena's location, but the fact that he was already dead in the eyes of his own company. The silence inside the stalled elevator was heavy, smelling of ozone, and the cold metallic tang of a trap snapping shut. Julian Vane stood in the center of the small, velvet-lined square, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against the yellowed letters in his pocket. He pressed the emergency call button, but there was no dial tone, only a hollow silence that confirmed his worst fears. Sterling Vance hadn't just moved for Julian's reputation, he had moved for his life. Up until 20 minutes ago, Julian had lived in a world where the only thing that could stop him was a line on a spreadsheet. But as the emergency lights flickered a sickly, dim red, He realized he was just a man caught in the very gears of the machine he had helped build. On the other side of those steel doors, Elias was being led away by Miller, the boy's small frame disappearing into the shadows of the hospital's private exit. Julian stared at the control panel, thinking about the digital image of the ledger Silas had sent before his heart gave out. $50 million. A gift from a father to a son, paid for by the life of a daughter and the childhood of a nephew. The weight of that theft felt more restrictive than the elevator walls. He had spent his life believing he was the architect of his own success. But he was merely the vault for his father's sins. Julian realized that if he died here, in the dark, the truth died with him. Sterling would take the warehouse district, the state would take Elias, and the Vane family legacy would continue its slow, quiet rot. He began to pry at the inner seam of the doors, his expensive loafers slipping on the polished floor. His fingers, which had never known manual labor, were already beginning to bleed, but with every inch of steel that groaned under his grip, he felt a strange, jagged surge of adrenaline. For the first time in 20 years, Julian Vane wasn't acting as a CEO. He was acting as a man fighting for his family. He managed to wedge the doors open, just enough to see the concrete floor of the 49th landing, about 3 feet above the elevator car. He pulled himself up, the rough edges of the hoistway scraping against his silk shirt, and rolled onto the dusty floor. He didn't stop to catch his breath. He ran for the emergency stairs, his mind racing through the letters Elias had carried. Elena's vision of a community center, the houses for people who don't have nice ones, wasn't just a dream. It was a blueprint for a life he had never allowed himself to imagine. He had been building towers to touch the sky, while his sister had been trying to build a foundation for the earth. Julian burst onto the rooftop helipad, the rain now a freezing gale that whipped at his face. His personal chopper sat idling, but it wasn't his pilot at the controls. Sterling Vance stood by the open cabin door, flanked by 2 men Julian didn't recognize. Board members who had always been the loudest in their praise of Julian's mathematics. Sterling's smile was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating mask. "You were supposed to stay in the box, Julian," Sterling said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the rotors. "The board has already signed the papers. You're incapacitated, unstable. The boy is being processed as we speak. He's not a project, Sterling." Julian shouted back, closing the distance between them. "He's my blood. And the fortune you're trying to steal is built on a crime that I'm about to expose." Julian pulled out the phone, the digital image of the ledger glowing brightly in the dark. "Silas gave me everything. The transfers, the shell accounts. The reason you and my father pushed Elena out. You didn't hate her for loving a musician. You hated her for being the only one who wouldn't lie for you." The board members looked at each other, the first flicker of doubt crossing their faces. They were businessmen. They could handle a scandal, but they couldn't handle a fraud that nullified the family's assets. Sterling lunged for the phone, but Julian dodged him, his movements fueled by a desperate human depth he hadn't felt since he was a boy. "Call the police, Miller," Julian yelled into his smartwatch. "I'm at the roof. Tell the DA that Julian Vane is ready to turn state's evidence against Vane Global." Sterling stopped, his eyes darting to the board members. He realized the gravity had shifted. Julian wasn't trying to save his brand anymore, he was trying to save his soul. "You'll lose everything, Julian," Sterling hissed. "Your penthouse, your cars, your name, you'll be nothing." Julian looked at the silver locket in his hand, and thought about Elias singing in the alley. A voice that didn't need a skyscraper to be heard. "I've been nothing for 20 years, Sterling," Julian said, his voice dropping to a grounding frequency that seemed to cut through the storm. "I just didn't realize it until I looked down." He turned toward the helipad edge, looking out over the city. He saw the warehouse district, the target of his father's final heist, and saw the lights of the theater district, where his nephew had been singing for nickels. He realized that dignity wasn't found at the top of a tower. It was found in the hands of a boy, who would return an expensive locket to a stranger, who had only offered him judgment. Julian turned back to the boardroom rivals, his posture straight and his eyes awake. "The board session starts in 10 minutes. I'll be there. But I won't be sitting at the head of the table. I'll be sitting in the witness chair." He walked past Sterling and the board members, headed for the stairs. He had to find Elias. He had to tell the boy that the cage was gone. But as he reached the roof door, it slammed shut, and the heavy metallic click of an external bolt echoed through the wind. Julian pulled at the handle, but it was dead. He looked through the reinforced glass and saw the housing official Sterling had brought earlier. holding the heavy iron key. Beyond him in the hallway, Julian saw two uniformed officers leading a struggling, terrified Elias toward the elevator. The same elevator Julian had just escaped. Sterling approached Julian from behind, a heavy wrench in his hand. His eyes filled with a murderous resolve. "Confessions are for the living, Julian," Sterling whispered. Julian realized that the most dangerous secret his father had hidden wasn't the money, but the fact that Julian was never supposed to survive the discovery. Julian saw the flash of steel in the dark, and realized he had run out of time to be a brother. Julian lunged forward as the wrench swung through the freezing rooftop air, a heavy arc of steel intended to end the confession, before it could ever reach the light. He rolled across the wet concrete, the rough surface tearing the shoulder of his mud-stained silk shirt. A garment that had once been a shield of status, but was now just another layer of ruin. He could hear Sterling's heavy, frantic breathing behind him, the sound of a man who realized that his silk-lined world was about to be obliterated by the very mathematics he had used to justify his greed. Julian scrambled to his feet, his viscers slick with rain and blood as he gripped his phone, the glowing digital ledger still displaying the evidence of a father's final theft. "You can't kill the truth, Sterling," Julian yelled over the roar of the wind and the dying hum of the helipad lights. "The file is already in the cloud. Miller has the physical stack. Elena's letters were never just memories, they were a death warrant for this empire." Sterling stopped, his face a pale mask of raw, predatory calculation. He looked at the board members, who were backing away into the shadows of the helicopter, their loyalty finally snapping under the weight of a crime that didn't have a profit margin. For 40 years, Julian had watched people calculate their worth in naira or dollars. But standing on this roof, he realized that true value was a currency the greedy couldn't spend. Suddenly, the roof door groaned, the heavy iron bolt vibrating under a violent impact from the other side. Julian's heart hammered against his ribs as he recognized the high, clear frequency of a silver voice calling his name. "Julian, Julian, open the door." It was Elias. The boy hadn't been led away to a state facility. He had broken free, driven by a primal instinct for the only blood relation he had left in the world. The housing official Sterling had bribed was struggling to hold the key, his face hollowing with fear as he realized he was no longer managing a protocol, but a revolution. Julian charged toward the door, ignoring Sterling's desperate lunges. He slammed his shoulder against the reinforced glass, the impact jarring his teeth. But he didn't stop until he saw the housing official stumble back. Julian grabbed the handle, his hands finally finding the manual release he had designed into the building's security years ago as a business precaution, never imagining it would be his own nephew's lifeline. The door swung open, and Elias surged inside, his oversized jacket soaked through, his small hands immediately reaching for Julian's. "They tried to put me in the cage, Julian," Elias gasped, his voice shaking with the exhaustion of a child who had been fighting for his dignity on every corner of the city. Julian pulled the boy into a fierce, grounding hug, the wet wool of Elias's donated coat pressing against his ruined suit. For the first time in his life, Julian didn't feel the stain. He felt the weight of a responsibility that all his vacations in Switzerland could never buy. He looked at Elias and saw, not a singer in a gutter, but the architect of a vision that Julian had been too afraid to build. Sterling Vance stood frozen in the center of the helipad, the wrench dangling from his fingertips like a useless tool. He watched as the board members finally stepped out of the chopper. Not toward Sterling, but toward the man holding a child. The power in the room had shifted, moving away from the head of the table, and toward the person who was finally willing to look down. "The press is at the gate, Julian," one of the board members said, his voice carrying the professional flatness of a man shifting his investment. "They want to know about the ledger. They want to know why Vane Global was hiding 50 million in your name." Julian stood up, his hand still firmly on Elias's shoulder. He looked at the skyscraper he had called home, and realized it was just an expensive prison, built on a foundation of contempt. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the stack of yellowed letters Elena had written, the blue ribbon now frayed and wet. "I'm not going to lie to them," Julian said, his voice dropping to a rhythmic, steady frequency that cut through the storm. "I'm going to tell them that my father was a thief, and that I spent 20 years being his vault. And then, I'm going to tell them that Elias Vane is the one who's taking the keys." Elias looked up at Julian, the silver willow locket glowing faintly in his palm. "Does this mean Silas was right? Does this mean I don't have to be invisible anymore?" Julian knelt one more time. the mud from the alley and the blood from the elevator doors marking him as a man who had finally joined the real world. No one is looking through you anymore, Elias. We're going to build your mother's vision. Wide doors, roof gardens, and steps built for everyone. Julian saw a real smile reach the boy's eyes, a shift that felt like sunlight breaking through a 20-year storm. But as Julian stood to lead Elias toward the stairs, a sudden, blinding flash erupted from the helipad perimeter. It wasn't the lightning of the storm, but the high-intensity strobes of a tactical team. Sterling Vance hadn't just brought board members. He had triggered a hostile takeover clause that authorized private security to clear the building of unstable elements. Sterling began to laugh again, a dry, rattling sound of corporate malice as the uniformed team began to close in, their weapons raised. Julian looked at Elias, then at the ledger on his phone, and finally at the edge of the roof. He realized that the most dangerous secret wasn't just the money his father stole, but the fact that the tactical team wasn't there to arrest Julian. They were there to make sure he never made it to the board meeting. Julian stared at the lead guard and saw the Vane Global crest on his chest. Realizing the machine he had built was now programmed to erase him, Julian felt the boy's hand tighten in his and realized that his sister's vision was the only thing left worth dying for. He looked at Elias and saw the guard's finger tighten on the trigger. The high-intensity strobes cut through the rainy darkness of the rooftop, turning the world into a series of jagged, frozen frames. Julian Vane didn't flinch. He stepped in front of Elias, shielding the boy's trembling frame with his own mud-stained body, the fabric of his ruined silk shirt flapping violently in the gale. He looked down at the red laser dot dancing across his chest, and felt a strange, cold peace. For 20 years he had lived like a man drowning in shallow water, but here, under the threat of his own private army, he finally felt like he was breathing. The golden sun was gone, and all that remained was a man who had finally learned that trust was the only currency that didn't depreciate. "Lower your weapons," Julian commanded, his voice dropping to a low, grounding frequency that seemed to vibrate through the very concrete of the helipad. It wasn't the shout of a CEO. It was the steady authority of a man who no longer feared losing anything he couldn't take with him. The lead guard, a man named Marcus who had served Julian for a decade, hesitated. He saw the billionaire kneeling in the dirt, blood from the elevator doors staining his hands, holding a child whose eyes held the same fierce intelligence Julian had lost along the way. The tactical team didn't lower their rifles, but the air shifted. The predatory calculation Sterling Vance had relied on was meeting the immovable wall of human dignity. Sterling lunged forward, his face twisted with the desperation of a predator who realized the trap was failing. "He's unstable, Marcus. You have the board's authorization. He's trying to liquidate the entire Vane legacy for a street brat." Sterling's voice cracked, the sound of a man whose silk-lined world was being obliterated by a truth he couldn't buy or bury. He turned to the board members who stood frozen by the helicopter. "If Julian speaks to the press, your shares are worthless. Everything we built is gone. Do your jobs." But the board members were no longer looking at their portfolios. They were looking at Julian's face, which held a look of peace they hadn't seen in 20 years. Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out the yellowed letters Elias had carried like a fortress. He held them up, the blue ribbon fraying in the wind. "These aren't just papers, Sterling. They are the receipts of every heart my father broke to build this tower. The 50 million in the account you and my father hid? It was Elena's life. It was Elias's childhood." Julian looked at Marcus and the other guards. "I am the majority shareholder until the stroke of midnight, and as my final act of authority, I am ordering an immediate stand down. If you fire, you aren't protecting a company. You're protecting a thief." The lead guard stared at Julian, then at the boy clutching the silver willow locket. Marcus had a son of his own, a boy who waited for him in a small apartment that Vane Global's mathematics would have deemed insignificant. He saw the way Julian held Elias not as a project or a liability but as blood. Slowly Marcus lowered his rifle. One by one the rest of the tactical team followed. The blinding strobes flickered and died, leaving the roof in the soft gray light of the Portland rain. Dignity had won a battle that money had already lost. "You fool," Sterling hissed, the wrench in his hand falling to the floor with a hollow clang. "You think being human is going to save you? The press is going to tear you apart. You'll be the man who turned a billion-dollar empire into a crime scene. You'll have nothing." Julian stood up, pulling Elias with him, and looked out over the city. He saw the warehouse district where Silas had died protecting the truth. And he saw the lights of the hospitals, where people were fighting for lives that Julian had previously only seen as numbers. He realized that becoming nobody was the only way to finally become someone who mattered. Julian turned to the board members. The confession isn't just mine, it's the family's. We are going to take the warehouse district and turn it into what Elena envisioned. We are going to build the foundation Silas died for. And if the Vane name has to burn to make that happen, then let it burn. It was a cold name anyway. He looked at Elias and saw a small, shy smile breaking through the boy's exhaustion. A shift that felt more valuable than every stock option Julian had ever signed. The billionaire Ashford Global CEO had forgotten what money was for, but the singer from the gutter had just reminded him. Miller, Julian said into his watch, his voice steady and rhythmic. Secure the lobby. Bring the DA and the lead reporters to the 50th floor. My nephew and I will be waiting for them. He began to lead Elias toward the roof door, but as he reached for the handle, he stopped. He looked at the housing official who was still holding the iron key. The man's face pale with the realization that he was on the wrong side of history. Julian didn't insult him, he didn't threaten him. He simply held out his hand. The key please, it's time to open the doors. The official handed over the heavy iron, his fingers shaking. Julian unlocked the door and stepped back into the hallway of his empire. No longer a king in a cage of glass, but a man walking with his kin. As they reached the elevator, Julian swiped his phone, watching the digital image of the ledger begin to upload to every major news outlet in the city. He was committing professional suicide to perform a human miracle. He felt the weight of his sister's letters in his pocket, and knew that for the first time in his life, he wasn't acting for his father. He was acting for the girl who had believed he was a prince. They entered the car, and Julian pressed the button for the ground floor. He looked at his reflection in the brass doors, the mud, the blood, and the raw exhaustion, and he didn't see a failure. He saw a brother. He looked at Elias, who was watching the floor numbers descend with a look of wonder. Are we going to be okay, Julian? The boy asked, his voice still holding that silver melody. Julian reached out and ruffled the boy's hair, a simple human gesture that broke the last of the ice in his chest. We're going to be better than okay, Elias. We're going to be real. The elevator chimed as it reached the lobby, but the doors didn't open. Instead, a red warning light flashed on the panel, and a voice crackled through the intercom, not Miller's, but a voice Julian hadn't heard in years. It was the voice of his father's lead attorney, a man who had helped erase Elena 20 years ago. Mr. Vane, the board has just invoked the mental competency clause. The police aren't here to take your confession. They're here to take you to a private facility for evaluation. And the boy is being returned to the state as an abandoned asset. Julian's grip on Elias's hand tightened, as he realized that the machine wasn't just built to protect the money. It was built to kill anyone who tried to give it away. He looked at the closed doors and realized he was trapped in the very vault he had built for his sister's ghost. The red warning light on the elevator panel pulsed like a slow bleeding heartbeat. Julian Vane stood in the center of the brass-lined car, his fingers digging into Elias's small hand as the cold voice of the family attorney echoed through the intercom. He was a billionaire who had spent his life believing he was the architect of his own destiny. But now he realized he was trapped in a vault of his own making. His father, Montgomery Ashford, had always taught him that the poor were dangerous, that they would bleed you dry if given an inch. But Julian looked down at the boy in the oversized jacket, a child who had nothing but a silver locket and the truth, and realized the danger had always been wearing a designer suit. Julian, I'm scared, Elias whispered, his voice losing its silver, melodic quality and turning into a jagged edge of terror. Julian knelt on the plush carpet of the stalled car, ignoring the ruin of his mud-stained trousers. He pulled the boy close, the wet wool of Elias's coat smelling of the rain, and the warehouse district Silas had died to protect. For the first time in 37 years, Julian didn't look at a person as a project or a liability. He looked at the boy and saw a future that money couldn't buy. He realized that dignity wasn't found at the top of a skyscraper, but in the hands of a mother who refused to let go. Even when the world turned cold, Julian pulled his phone from his pocket, the screen glowing with the image of the stolen inheritance ledger. Listen to me, Elias. My father built this company on a lie. He thought success was about accumulation and power, but he was bankrupt of basic human decency. He made me a vault for his sins, but tonight I'm opening the doors. He began typing a frantic command to his lead security officer, Miller. He knew that if the board succeeded in declaring him mentally incompetent, The truth would be buried forever in a private facility, and Elias would be returned to the very cage Silas had tried to shield him from. The intercom crackled again, the attorney's voice dripping with the predatory calculation of a man who measured worth in naira and stock options. Julian, be reasonable. You're having a breakdown. The warehouse, the locket, this sudden obsession with a singer from the gutter. It's instability. Give us the ledger, and we can make this go away quietly. You can keep your penthouse. You can keep your name. Julian looked at his reflection in the brass doors, seeing a man covered in warehouse dust and hospital grief, and for the first time, he liked the man he saw. He realized that becoming nobody was the only way to finally become someone who mattered. I'm not giving you anything, Sterling, Julian said toward the intercom, his voice dropping to a low, grounding frequency. You think the walls protect you, but they just make the prison more expensive. The truth is already in the air. You can lock this elevator, but you can't stop the wind. He hit send on a mass email to every major news outlet in Portland and Boston, attaching the ledger and Elena's final letters. He was committing professional suicide to perform a humanistic miracle, trading his empire for the dignity of a sister he had spent 20 years trying to forget. Suddenly, a violent shudder rocked the car. The cable groaned, and the elevator surged upward. Not toward the lobby, but toward the 50th floor boardroom. Julian realized the board wasn't waiting for the police. They were bringing the problem to them. He stood up, shielding Elias with his own body as the doors finally chimed and slid open. He expected a tactical team, but instead, he saw the boardroom filled with the very people who had helped his father erase Elena. Men and women who had watched him grow up, and never once told him his life was a crime. Sterling Vance stood at the head of the table, his silk suit pristine, his smile a razor-sharp mask of corporate resolve. Welcome home, Julian. We've had a vote while you were playing hero in the slums. He gestured to a city housing official standing in the corner with a stack of legal papers. The state has already issued the emergency protective order. The boy goes to the facility tonight. And you, Julian, are being escorted to the airport. Your accounts are frozen. The Vane name belongs to the board now. Elias's hand tightened in Julian's, his small frame shaking with a bone-deep exhaustion Julian had never known. Julian stepped out of the car, his posture straight and his eyes awake with a fierce protective power that didn't come from a stock portfolio. He looked at the executives who had previously only seen Elias as a street brat, and saw them for what they were. People who had forgotten that wealth is worthless if it doesn't multiply meaning. You're late, Sterling, Julian said, holding his phone up like a weapon. The ledger is live. The press is already downloading the proof that every building this company owns was built with stolen trust. You aren't protecting a legacy, you're managing a crime scene. The room went silent as phones began to chime and buzz on the mahogany table. One by one, the board members looked at their screens, their faces paling as they saw the digital ghost of Elena Vane, returning to claim her son's future. Sterling lunged for Julian, his face twisting with a rage that finally broke through his silk-lined composure. You've destroyed us. You've turned $11 billion into ash for a gutter brat science project. Julian didn't flinch. He looked at the notebook Elias held, the one filled with drawings of buildings with wide doors and roof gardens, and felt a peace he hadn't known in decades. I didn't destroy it, Sterling. I just reminded you what money is actually for, Julian said softly, his words carrying the weight of 20 years of suffering compressed into a single realization. He turned to the housing official, who was staring at his own phone with a look of raw, unguarded shock. You have a choice. You can execute that order and become an accomplice to a 20-year fraud. Or you can look at the boy who actually owns the tower you're standing in. Julian saw the man's hand tremble as he looked from the papers to the silver locket Elias was holding. The sound of heavy boots and radio chatter began to rise from the hallway. The actual police arriving. But not for the reasons Sterling had promised. Julian felt the elevator car settle into the floor behind him, but then he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It wasn't a siren or a shout. It was the sound of a mechanical click coming from the ceiling of the car. Elias was still standing in. Julian turned just in time to see the ceiling hatch of the elevator swing open and a dark, masked figure drop into the car. A silencer-equipped pistol aimed directly at the boy. Julian realized that the most dangerous secret wasn't the money, but the fact that Elias was the only thing standing between the board and total immunity. He lunged back toward the doors, but they began to slide shut, locking him out as he saw the figure's finger tighten on the trigger. The brass elevator doors hissed shut with a finality that sounded like a tomb closing. Julian Vane threw himself against the metal, his fingers clawing at the gap, but the mechanism was locked from the inside. He was paralyzed by the image burned into his mind. A dark, masked figure hovering over Elias with a weapon leveled at the boy's heart. Through the reinforced glass, he could see the silhouette of the assassin preparing to fire. Julian had spent his life managing risks from a distance. But in this moment, the math of his world was zero. He wasn't a CEO or a billionaire. He was a man about to watch his only remaining blood be erased by the very machine his family had built. "Elias, get down!" Julian screamed, his voice raw, vibrating with a frequency of desperation that cracked the polished silence of the hallway. Sterling Vance stood behind him, the wrench still gripped in his hand, a look of pale, hollow satisfaction on his face. Sterling wasn't a visionary anymore. He was a man who had realized that dead men tell no tales and heirs provide no evidence. Julian turned on him, his eyes wide and awake with a primal power. He didn't care about the board members or the police sirens rising from the street below. He only cared about the child in the vault. Inside the elevator car, Elias stared up at the masked intruder. The boy's small hands were white-knuckled as they gripped the twin silver lockets, the willow engravings pressing into his palms. He didn't scream. He didn't beg. He remembered Silas's voice telling him that a vein never fades, even in the rain. The assassin's finger tightened on the trigger, the silencer a cold black eye. But then, Elias began to hum. It was the same silver melody he had sung in the alley, a high, clear note that seemed to bounce off the brass walls, and fill the tiny space with a defiant, human warmth. The elevator car suddenly lurched. The tactical team on the roof had regained manual control. Or perhaps Miller had found a way to bypass the security lock. The car dropped 3 inches, then surged upward with a violent jolt. The assassin lost his footing, his shot grazing the velvet lining of the car instead of the boy. Julian heard the muffled thud of the discharge, and felt his soul fracture. He lunged at the hallway control panel, using his blood-slicked thumb to punch in the emergency override code he had never shared with the board. "I am the architect," Julian whispered through gritted teeth. "And I am taking my house back." The doors groaned, the secondary locks clicking open as Julian's override took hold. He didn't wait for them to fully slide. He squeezed his body through the opening, his mud-stained silk shirt tearing as he tackled the masked figure. They hit the floor of the car with a bone-jarring impact. Julian had never fought for anything in his life except a percentage point. But now he was fighting with a human depth that made him move like smoke. He saw the assassin's eyes, cold, professional, and filled with the mathematics of a job. And Julian realized this man had been hired by his own father's estate to clean up the instability. Julian gripped the assassin's wrist, twisting with a strength fueled by 20 years of suppressed grief. The pistol skittered across the floor, sliding toward Elias. "Pick it up, Elias!" Julian shouted, his voice a jagged edge. "Don't let the cage close." The boy scrambled for the weapon, his small frame shaking with a bone-deep exhaustion. He held the gun with 2 hands, pointing it not at the man, but at the control panel. Elias hadn't spent his life in boardrooms. He had spent it in warehouses, learning that when a machine tries to kill you, you break the gears. Elias fired into the floor selection panel. Sparks showered the car, the scent of burning copper and ozone filling the air. The elevator screeched to a halt, the lights dying as the entire building's power grid short-circuited. They were trapped in total darkness. A billion-dollar tower turned into a hollow shell of steel and rain. Julian managed to pin the assassin in the corner, his hands feeling for the man's throat. He felt the silver willow locket in his own pocket growing hot, a reminder that the most valuable things in life are the ones you can't protect with a vault. "Who sent you?" Julian hissed into the dark. The assassin didn't answer, his breathing heavy and rhythmic like a cornered animal. Julian realized that the man was just another casualty of the system, a worker paid to be a monster so billionaires could keep their hands clean. Julian let go of the man's throat, his anger replaced by a crushing wave of character and humanity. He looked toward where he knew Elias was huddling. "It's over, Elias. The lights are out, they can't see us anymore." The silence in the dark car was heavy, filled with the ghosts of a father's theft and a sister's vision. Julian reached out, his hand finding Elias's wet, oversized jacket. He pulled the boy close, the two of them breathing in sync in the heart of the tower. Julian had always called his kingdom. "He's still there, isn't he?" Elias whispered, his voice small but steady. "Silas. He told me that even when the world goes dark, the truth is a light you carry inside." Julian felt a tear track through the warehouse dust on his face, the first honest thing he had produced in decades. Julian pulled his phone out, the battery at 1%. He opened the ledger image one last time, the digital burn of the theft glowing like a beacon in the confined space. He saw the account numbers, the names of the board members who had benefited from his sister's exile, and the final signature of Silas Vane Sr. He realized that the golden son was never meant to inherit the company. He was meant to be the fall guy when the fraud was eventually discovered. His father hadn't loved him. He had insured himself against Julian. Suddenly a rhythmic pounding began on the doors above them. It was Miller. "Mr. Vane. We're prying the doors on 50. The police are here, but Sterling is claiming you've taken the boy hostage. He's calling for a tactical breach." Sterling was playing his final card, turning Julian into the villain of the very story Julian was trying to fix. Julian looked at the assassin in the corner, then at the gun in Elias's lap, and finally at the ceiling hatch. He realized that to save the boy, he couldn't just confess. He had to disappear. Julian stood up, lifting Elias onto his shoulders. He reached for the ceiling hatch, the metal cold and slick with the rain that was leaking through the roof vents. "We're going to the ledge, Elias. We're going to show them the vision." Julian pushed the hatch open, the roar of the storm and the glare of news chopper spotlights flooding the elevator car. He climbed out onto the top of the car, standing in the middle of the Portland skyline. A billionaire standing on the ruins of his own legacy. He walked to the very edge of the elevator shaft's rooftop housing and looked down. Thousands of people were gathered at the gate, their phones held up like a sea of digital stars. Watching the downfall of Vane Global, Julian pulled the letters from his pocket and threw them into the wind. The yellowed papers danced in the spotlights, thousands of pages of a sister's love and a father's crime raining down on the city like snow. But as he turned to lead Elias to safety, Julian saw Sterling Vance standing on the boardroom balcony above them. A flare gun aimed directly at the leaking fuel line of the rooftop generator. Julian realized the most dangerous secret wasn't the money, but the fact that Sterling was willing to burn the whole tower down, just to keep the boy from speaking. Julian saw the spark hit the fuel and realized he was standing on a bomb. The rooftop generator didn't explode. The spark from Sterling's flare gun hit the wet concrete inches from the fuel line. The fire snuffed out by the same relentless rain that had washed Julian Vane's soul clean. Julian didn't wait for Sterling to reload, or for the board to cast another vote. He grabbed Elias and swung them back through the elevator hatch, just as Miller and the actual police breached the hallway doors. The high-stakes mathematics of Vane Global had finally failed, replaced by the simple, undeniable weight of a child's testimony and a sister's letters. Within an hour, the spotlights that had hunted them became the floodlights of a global scandal, exposing a pharmaceutical empire built on the theft of a daughter's life. 3 months later, the glass tower still stood, but the name at the top had changed. It was no longer a monument to Silas Vane's greed, but the headquarters of the Willow Foundation. Julian Vane had stepped down as CEO, liquidating 80% of his personal assets to fund the very vision Elena had sketched in her journals. He had traded his Italian wool coats for a simple jacket, and his penthouse for a quiet life of responsibility. He had learned that wealth is a heavy coat to wear when you're trying to walk towards someone else. And for the first time in his life, he was traveling light. On a crisp spring evening, Julian and Elias returned to the Theater District alley, where their journey had begun. Shadows were still long, and the brick walls still echoed with the distant hum of the city, but the air felt different. Julian watched his nephew walk toward the exact spot where he had first seen the boy singing for Nichols. Elias was taller now, his face filled with the steady confidence of a child who knew his name meant something more than a line on a ledger. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet jewelry box, a gift from Julian to replace the lockets that were now evidence in a federal trial. Inside the box sat a single, new silver locket. It was engraved with a willow tree, its branches reaching toward the ground to provide shelter. Elias knelt by the dumpster where Silas had once hidden his secrets. He didn't leave the locket for a ghost. He left it for the woman huddling there now. She was young, her eyes filled with the same bone-deep exhaustion Julian had previously looked through. She stared at the velvet box as if it were a trap, her fingers trembling as they touched the silver. "It's not a trick," Elias said softly, his voice carrying that same grounded melody that had once stopped Julian mid-stride. "It's a reminder that you're not invisible. Someone is listening." The woman looked up, and for a moment the rich versus poor barrier that Julian had spent 40 years maintaining simply vanished. There was no billionaire and no beggar in that alley. There were only 3 human beings recognizing that character is the only currency that never devalues. Julian realized that the greatest building he would ever construct wasn't made of steel, but of the dignity he had finally returned to his family. As they walked out of the alley and back toward the light of the main street, Julian felt a hand slip into his. He looked down at Elias and saw his sister's eyes, intelligent, fierce, and full of hope. The legacy of Elena Vane wasn't the millions they had recovered, but the boy who would use them to make sure no one else had to sing in the dark. Julian looked back at the shadows one last time, and realized he wasn't running from his father's sins anymore. He was walking toward his sister's grace. The Vane name would always be associated with a scandal, but Julian knew that the real story was the one they were writing now. It was a heartwarming success story, not of money made, but of humanity found. He had spent his life building towers to touch the sky, only to realize that the most important view was the one he found when he finally decided to look down. The alley was quiet again, but the echo of Elias's song remained, a silver thread connecting the tower to the street. Julian Vane was no longer a king in a vault. He was a man standing on the earth, ready to build something that would last. If this story reminded you that talent has no zip code, share it with someone who needs a reason to keep singing today. For more stories about the hidden strength in all of us, subscribe to Mansion Tales. Tell us in the comments, have you ever ignored a gift because of how it was wrapped? Let us know.